So I'm looking forward to hearing Sam talk about the free market solutions.
Thank you, Mimi. It's great to be here and at the Preserving the American Dream Conference again. And thanks you guys thank you all actually for hanging out for the last couple minutes of a full day before the dinner. I know it's been a long day. And I've been an avid consumer of Catherine's work, so I'm really proud to be up on here and say, yeah, I read your stuff. Yeah, it helps to know. Yeah, Mitch is a good guy. So anyway. Also, Ed and I have worked for a long time on these issues as well, so it's kind of fun to be up here. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk as much about the free market solutions as I am about, I think, is this feedback coming by something's, do we need to turn one of these off or something? Anyway, about the dismantlement of the statewide growth management law in Florida. Are those on or off? I'm not sure. Well, maybe if I go back here. Oh, no, we're still getting it, aren't we? All right. All right. So we'll do that. Yeah, my wife does have a big mouth. All right. Oh, there's
yeah, there's some kind of a mixer here, but I don't know.
Yeah, we're getting some sort of feedback somewhere. I'm not sure what it is. But anyway, because actually the Florida story is an extraordinary story. And it's actually one that we have to be careful that may not be repeated for actually many of the reasons that Catherine's talking about in terms of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And so it's an extraordinary story about, one, what can actually happen in the United States. There was a time when I thought we could look over at the Soviet Union and we could say, well, that will never happen in the U.S. But actually, if you look at what was implemented in Florida in terms of statewide planning, you have to come away from it and say, yes, it can be implemented in the United States. We didn't have the gulags. We didn't have the military. We didn't have that part of it. But in terms of the central planning, we had it in Florida. And it literally was a top-down planning process. And if you can imagine this, I mean, and my students, I have to ask them every once in a while, do you guys remember know what the Soviet Union was? But if you're a little bit older, so it's actually that raises another issue maybe we can talk about in Q&A. Part of the issue is the younger generation doesn't understand what the potential impacts of this are. But literally what happened was that Florida adopted in 1985 an enhancement of an Environmental Protection Act, which was statewide and adopted statewide growth management. They adopted a statewide plan. They established the authority of ensuring that local plans were consistent with the statewide plan through a state-level department, and they were not allowed to implement anything that wasn't approved by the state that was consistent with the statewide plan. And it's one of these things we can say, well, what are they going to do? Well, actually, state and local government, local and county governments are creatures of the state government. They can actually do a lot. And at first, what happened was many of the people that supported the growth management plan, or the growth management law and reform, really thought, well, the department's going to be reasonable about this. They're not just going to go in and try and impose their view. Well, of the 399 cities that had to submit their plans to the state, in the first round, they gave them about 3 or 4 years to actually submit a plan and to be checked to see if they were in compliance. 53% were turned down because they were not compliant with the state plan. Of the counties, 85%, actually I should be going through my slides at this point, were turned down because they were not compliant with the state plan. And actually, so let me go, we've already sort of actually got off on the wrong sort of direction, but that's all right. We'll sort of move forward anyway. Because part of this is understanding the implementation of the law and what it was. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through here. So in the 1970s, there was a state law that was passed that was really focused on environmental protection. And by the way, that's not a non-trivial issue in Florida. If we think about it, in fact, I think these population numbers are pretty extraordinary. Now, before moving to Florida 3 years ago to work at Florida State, I lived in Ohio. I mean, we would have loved to have just positive population growth. Here you have a state where every decade is experiencing 30 and 40% increases in population. That means every 2 or 3 decades, they're doubling their population. And this is a state with what most people would consider as environmentally sensitive land. The Everglades is not one of these things. You can just sort of dump all sorts of stuff in it, and it's just going to recover. So these are real issues, and that's what was motivating in the 1970s the move toward stronger environmental protection. But then in 1985, now notice that in 1985 is when we had the modification of the integrated statewide growth management law. Notice that it's sort of interesting. That was also in the middle of the supposed national resurgence toward conservatism and limited government. That was he's actually into his second term. Was he second? Yeah, second term at this point. Yet in Florida, what you had is the adoption of a rigorous, top-down central planning process on land use. And it wasn't just compliance that was the issue. It was also a question of whether or not it was furthering what they called statewide goals. Concurrency, Wendell mentioned it earlier. Concurrency is the idea that any new development should have infrastructure in place to support it before it actually can take place. That was a huge part of this plan, which meant that essentially developers had to completely front all of the financing necessary to support any project, really, literally, could have been of any size, but any project of any consequence we're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that you'd have to come up with to finance, to make sure the water, sewer, roads were all in place. It was unworkable. But the other part of this, which is important to understand, is that Florida's growth management law, as well as the statewide plan, had an explicit focus to reduce sprawl, move people into more compact developments, more compact cities, direct people and businesses into the built-up portions of the state, and to try and minimize the amount of single-family housing that could be developed. All right, so I've already mentioned this. So it wasn't just that you had to be in compliance with the law. You actually had to be furthering the state's goals of reducing sprawl and promoting compact development. And part of that was also transit, but that wasn't as strong as simply the idea of trying to limit the amount of space that housing was taking and really put people into higher density areas. So when they were failed, they didn't fail because they were really technically out of compliance. These plans were turned down because they were not furthering the state's interest in anti-sprawl goals. So it was the interpretation. What we found happening is that the Department of Community Affairs was actually reinterpreting the rules and regulations in order to advance the statewide goals. So they didn't have explicit statutory authority to turn them down on the grounds in which they were turned down. They were interpreting these broad goals that the state had, but many of which were in contradiction or contradictory, and then forcing them back to the state level so that they could become more aggressive in reducing sprawl and promoting compact development in higher densities. So 85 counties suffered even more than the cities did in this case. What we found in this process, I actually jokingly tell some of my colleagues at Florida State, who are, by the way, conventional planners. I'm a libertarian, and that's a whole other story about why a libertarian is actually teaching urban planning in a very conventional urban planning department, by the way. It actually says a lot for Florida State's planning department, but that's another story. But I jokingly tell my colleagues that one of the reasons why I'm a libertarian is because I study implementation. I actually look at what government does as opposed to what it wants to do. And this is kind of where we run into this also in terms of the costs of conventional planning. In the real world of planning, development approval is very lengthy. It's a negotiated process. It's nothing, very little of it is actually done administratively or efficiently. It almost inevitably results in substantial upfront costs in order to meet all of the approvals and get and secure all the entitlements you need for development. And in the real world, it reduces the dynamism and innovation in the housing market because you have to build for the plan as opposed to what consumers might want. The kinds of things that Rick Harrison are doing are really difficult to get through a conventional planning process because they don't anticipate those innovations. Because they can't anticipate the innovations, They don't really have an effective way to approve it without going through an even lengthier process. And also what we find is that zoning is pretty much ineffective in that most of what it does is secures existing land use, and it really doesn't accommodate new development. In terms of Florida and what we saw happening what we found is that it was taking cities 2 to 4 years to become compliant. Counties would typically take 2 years. Basically, if everybody's getting slapped on the wrist and it's being forced back, they kind of learned the lesson pretty quickly, and they figured out a way to meet the state's goals and objectives. But also, what we found sort of a couple of interesting things. We talked a little bit about how the DCA sort of evaluated plans based on the state goals, but the other interesting thing was we found concurrency had a double whammy in the real estate market. One is that amendments were only allowed twice a year, so if somebody came up with a good idea, you still had to wait a certain amount of time before you could get a change, and then of course the state would actually have to approve the change. So just because you approved it locally didn't mean the state was going to go along with it. So it actually had to go up this chain. It restricted current land by doing that. In other words, whatever your plan is, it sort of tried to lock that in place. But it also meant that you couldn't add new land into the real estate market as well. So you had two things going on. One, you could not have effective coordination in the real estate market to meet new demand. The other is you simply weren't adding to supply. And as many people people in this room are wouldn't be surprised, we've ran into some serious affordable housing issues. When we look at, there are various affordable housing indexes that are used in Florida, but we had only 18 counties that were considered unaffordable based on a conventional index produced, this is the Schoenberg Center in Affordability Index in 1995. By the way, this is 10 years after the growth management law has been implemented, but by 2005, we had 49 counties out of the 69 that were no longer affordable. That's an extraordinary growth, and you can see a lot of it starts edging up here. And what we found when I did some statistical analysis of Florida, we found that after we controlled for many other factors, that at least 20% of the change in housing prices could be directly attributed to the compliance with the statewide growth management law. Essentially, we looked at how long the city and the county had been planning under the statewide growth management law. The longer they had been planning under that system, the greater the effect on housing prices and reducing housing affordability. And we also extended that for the James Madison Institute for a study and found that the effects remained as well. So essentially what happened is after 2 decades of this, people began to realize that there were problems. The system wasn't working very effectively. We began to see that there was substantial resistance on the local level. It's important to understand that many people, citizens, normal everyday citizens, recognize the problems. This was not something that was just among elites and academics, or actually, I'll talk about the academics in a minute. But the other critical part of this is also understanding that large developers understood that this was a real problem. Now here's a dynamic that a lot of times we don't realize. It's really important to understand. If you're a developer and you're of any size at all, you're not going to tick off your local planning department. You are not going to tick off the state-wide planning department, because once you start doing that, they're going to figure out a way to deny your plans and deny your amendments. The incentive is to play along as best you can. And California is a great case of where this has happened. The result is there are no small developers, land developers anymore in California. There are no small builders anymore, because you cannot afford to play that game if you're a small business. So we were quickly getting to that point in Florida. The other issue we found is that, and a lot of people don't quite realize this, but it became important when we sort of tried to understand what Rick Scott was able to do. There was actually academic research showing that the law wasn't working. A lot of that actually came from the DeVoe Moore Center, because that's one of we were charged with trying to look at market-oriented approaches to housing and land use. We were established in 1998. We, in fact, put together a conference that was critical of land use planning, and out of that came a book, which Planning Magazine actually reviewed and said it was the most thorough challenge yet to regional land use planning. This is back in 2001. Then we continued to support research that was critical of the statewide growth management law and other policies. And so in 2004, we also published another book that was explicitly identifying the problems with the growth management law. By the way, those came out of the shop at the Urban Planning Department in Florida State, which is, there tends to be a little bit more pragmatic about this stuff than many other planning departments. So we had some academic work that was becoming important. And then we also found that there's some early signs of resistance at the ballot box to trying to be more stringent with land use planning. In particular, I don't have time to go completely into it, but we had this hometown democracy initiative, which essentially said that any amendment to a comprehensive plan had to go up to public debate, to public vote. And that was defeated pretty soundly, in fact. And it was bipartisan resistance. We had the editorial boards of the newspapers saying this is a bad idea. We had the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association saying this is a bad idea. You had academics, you had Tea Partiers, you had libertarians and conservatives. They were all recognized that this was really a left-wing agenda to just completely lock down all growth, and most Floridians were not interested in that. Nevertheless, and this is really important for understanding the setup to the dismantlement of the statewide growth management law. We had, Wendell's already mentioned earlier, Randall's done some great work on this, but we were part of the housing bubble. We actually saw the housing bubble beginning to really burst in 2005, 2006, 2007. I can't go into all the dynamics of that, but what happened was when the crash hit, it hit us really, really hard, and the result was, and the second biggest industry after tourism in Florida is construction. So we had a lot of people out of work. So, so that was actually setting the stage for some sort of a change, a political change. So that gets us to Rick Scott, who is, I would like to say he's a hero on the growth management. He's a hero on a couple of different levels, at least in the first 2 years of his gubernatorial administration. He was in a but he was kind of a bystander on the on the dismantlement of the statewide growth management law. Essentially, what had happened is that as he was going around stumping on campaigns, people were talking, they were complaining, builders were coming in, land developers were coming in, and complaining about the length of time it took to get approvals, talking about how that the local governments would approve something and go through the state and the state would reverse it, and I realized that this is a big, big problem. And then he consulted with a lot of the large landowners and land developers and realized, no, this is a really big problem. These are the meetings that don't go on in front of the public. These are the ones where you're talking to donors, you're talking to others, and he realized this big issue. When he was, then when he was elected, he essentially put in charge someone who was not an ideologue, but recognized the value of the practical effects of this dysfunctional system, and they effectively dismantled the statewide growth management law using the term reform. Now, it was the statewide growth management law, but that didn't do really anything at the local level. Essentially what it did is we had already established comprehensive planning and zoning on the state through the growth management law in 1985. That essentially was done once all the plans were in compliance. And all the rural areas also had have the same level of detail and planning, but at least it got the state out of the business. So it's not a free market nirvana. This is not Houston. This is basically Florida looking like Ohio, Pennsylvania, a lot of northeastern states. And so we just have the same mess everybody else has. It's just not quite as terrible as it was before. So we still have market socialism. It's just more decentralized than it was before. Actually, it's not even market socialism. It's really sort of corporate socialism, the way it works. All right. So anyway, and Rick Scott is clearly he's really no friend of smart growth. He's now more in a political, he's dealing with some practical aspects. So the question then, one of the things Randall wanted me to talk about is how important was the Tea Party in this? Tea Party was pretty important, but I would argue that the Tea Party was a necessary but not sufficient condition for the dismantling of the statewide growth management law. The reality is what I found, and Ed's done a lot of work working with Tea Partiers, and I would say that our Tea Partiers, meaning Floridians, are more knowledgeable about local land use issues than most people in the Tea Party, and there are some reasons why that's true. But the reality is that what we found is the general public didn't have the level of knowledge and understanding of the way the process worked well enough to be effective when it went into the state legislature. Essentially, you needed professionals. What you meant by professionals were people that were in the industry, understood how it worked, knew how to fashion a reform agenda that could actually get through the legislature, which was in a unique moment, which was willing to accept sort of this devolution idea and getting the state out. But that could not have happened without the resurgence of limited government small government, fiscally conservative, popular movement, which the Tea Party embodied in Florida as well as elsewhere. So, and to some extent, the Tea Party showed that it was pretty weak when it came to the actual governance, when it came to the implementation stuff. It simply didn't have the necessary tools or knowledge to make it work. And I'll be happy to be more specific about that in Q&A. I think I'm probably down, I'm down to 1 minute. But then again, maybe that's not what their core competency is. And I'm perfectly willing, and I would love to develop that. Certainly I would be committed to doing that on the national level, not just in Florida. But I don't think we could have gotten I think there were lots of people that wanted to get this dismantling happening a lot earlier, but they couldn't do it, and they couldn't have done it without the popular support. A lot of that was organized, at least on a broad level, in terms of core values and core governance principles by the Tea Party. So without that, I don't think we would have had this. We would still be under the Soviet-style land use planning. So the critical roles for the Tea Party I see is they're absolutely essential to raising awareness. Actually, I'm being a lot more hospitable and open to the Tea Party than I thought I was going to be when I was asked to put this together. But I think as sort of thinking about this and understanding how the dynamics work, I began to realize this is there really is an important role. Give you a sense, though, about the implementation. Last May, I pulled together in a not quite closed door, but not open meeting, about 5 former DC Department of Community Affairs secretaries. Got them in the room. We just wanted to have a candid conversation. Want to know what were the growth management challenges Florida still faced. In that conversation was this dismantling of the state influence. Not at one point in this 3-hour conversation did the Tea Party come up as being a factor, negative or positive. That's not necessarily saying that they weren't effective, because again, I think their role was setting the stage, creating an environment where this could happen. And there were at least, and the DCA secretary who was responsible for the reform and the dismantling was part of this group. And he knew what he was doing because he was a land developer and he understood what the problems were. He knew where the pressure points were, and he knew how to tweak it. And he knew they had a small window to get this done with Governor Scott in his first 2 years. So it's important, but in order for the Tea Party to become more effective, it needs to develop a more strategic policy focus. Also, its grassroots connections are really, really important, but it can't lose sight of the importance of creating a broad-based political climate for change. Because if you don't have that, nothing happens. And it is really, really tough to get any reform of any toward a free market or limited government direction once you have the state planning in place. And I think that's the other lesson from Florida. Thank you very much.